Hello and welcome back, Rick here, and this is the spoilers discussion sort of area for the first two episodes of Star Trek Discovery. If you're looking for a spoiler-free general impressions one, I did a video on it previously, which I will probably link or thumbnail or whatever. But yeah, here we go then. So from the get-go, I would say that the plot in this is fairly safe. It doesn't really do much that I'd consider unpredictable. It starts off with them investigating a broken beacon, which takes them all of about 5 minutes to work out it's probably been deliberately damaged as a ploy to draw the Federation out onto the edges of its space. Ooh, no, wait, tell a lie. That's not where it opened. It opens with a completely irrelevant scene of the Federation going down to a planet and saving a colony that's in a desert world by supplying them with water and by drilling out their well and allowing them to survive. Now this is all done, of course, as character introductions, so we get to meet Michael Burnham and Captain Georgiou, and despite the fact that this whole scene, I think, feels like a complete disregard for the Prime Directive, they're interfering with another culture's ethos and evolution, even if it's going bad. But whatever, it paints the Federation as the good guys, so moving on. So now they get picked up by their ship, the USS Shenzhou. Georgiou's the captain of, and Michael Burnham serves as number one. In fact, they refer to her as number one throughout this quite a bit, which is a nice nod. I've got to say, the look and the design of everything as well, it looks really nice, really sleek. The CGI is brilliant, and it's kind of the best Star Trek's looked on TV for quite a while, in my opinion, anyway. And on a side note, the opening sequence looks brilliant. The parchment-style schematics of the ships and everything, it looks great. And from what we've seen of the opening sequence, the actual profile of the USS Discovery doesn't actually look too bad when it's in motion, so it looks alright. Got to say though, I can't actually remember the opening tune. It's not as iconic and it hasn't stuck in my head like TNG or any of the others. But then again, I've only heard it a couple of times, so we'll see what happens. Anyway, back to the crew, who find the plot device floating in space, so they decide to go investigate it. Both Lieutenant Saru and Michael Burnham theorise that this is very likely a trap. They are of course correct. We're also led to believe here that they don't agree on much, and they tend to have differing opinions on a lot of things, this being, I guess, the inter-crew drama that was being mentioned about before. I do find it a bit weird, though, that after 7 years working together they've not reached some sort of amiable approach on things, but Georgiou does mock it several times as well, saying, oh, look at this, they're actually agreeing, isn't this weird, make a note in the ship's log, and so on and so forth. So they detect something just out of sensor range in sort of a dampening field area caused by the debris of the binary star system they're in, and Burnham decides that the only way to actually go have a look is to actually, go have a physical look. So they use the captain's telescope to have a look at it, which is pretty good because their technology can't get a clear read on it. So this is immediately followed by the idea that Burnham could just jump in a spacesuit and go over and have a look to save risking the ship. Now I like this because for a couple of reasons. It shows her character. It shows the mix of logical approach but the emotional impulses that seem to be driving it, and I feel that's going to be a recurring theme throughout this show. We see a bit of it come up later on, but I think she's the kind of character who, being raised by Vulcans but still being human, uses logic to actually justify her emotional actions rather than the other way around. Whereas you should be using logic to inform your decisions, I feel like she's using logical arguments to justify her impulsive actions. Now she makes her way over there and discovers this Klingon-style relic floating in space, upon which she meets the Torchbearer, who's a Klingon in full regal ancient-styled armour, wielding a bat'leth. They don't get along. He tries to attack her, she pseudo-accidentally kills him by activating a jetpack and impaling him on his own bat'leth. This is, needless to say, a diplomatic incident waiting to happen. In point of fact, it has just happened. So cue up a perfectly timed flashback and we get to see her past, how she ended up orphaned and growing up on Vulcan, presumably under the care of Sarek, being raised the only way the Vulcans know how, by sticking her in a spherical pod and making her recite facts until they're ingrained. So yes, despite being human, she is quite clearly raised as a Vulcan, meaning she has the emotional state, but she is trained to think like a Vulcan. And again, this comes up later on, and I think it's going to be the major driving story of her character arc. So for the sake of convenience, I'm going to tack on the end of the other flashback to this one. So basically there seems to have been some sort of attack on the Vulcan Science Academy, presumably Klingons, again I think the same species that orphaned her. So as we can see, there's going to be a lot of pent up anger and distrust of the Klingons, especially for her. Now we see Sarek save her life by a Vulcan mind meld, but this leaves a sort of residual trace of his culture in her mind as an impression, allowing them to communicate over long distances via telepathy, although it's not easy. And it's something Sarek didn't really tell her about, it sort of crops up a bit later on. Now on the Klingon side of things, they're off burying the Torchbearer, who they bury with full Klingon honours. So they bury him in the sarcophagus and the mummification, and of course they then howl to Sto-vo-kor to let him know that the warrior is on his way, which is carried over from the TNG style Klingon era, which is a nice inclusion. It was a good part of their culture. Now the weird quirky addition here is that the coffin then is ejected into space, where it latches onto the outside of the ship as a sort of demi-armour for the vessel. They say it probably wouldn't actually provide any sort of protection, but it's a nice symbolic metaphor, the dead still protecting the living sort of thing. We've also learned a lot about T'Kuvma in these past couple of scenes. He was introduced as well earlier, but he's basically is seeking to unify all the houses. Now we knew this already. What's weird about it though is that he's doing it on an almost religious level. He's got a sort of zealotry to him. He almost believes himself to be sort of the reincarnation of Kahless, probably metaphorically speaking. But this is how we see what his view is. He's aware that the 24 fractured houses of the Klingons' society can't continue to function as they are, because eventually they'll break down to infighting. So he wants to use the Federation as a common threat for them to fight against, thus unifying them all under his name. Now the followers of him are all again adorned in the similar style to him, and I think this is all likely because they're very much adherents to ancient Klingon customs. So like the burying people and the mummification, that's all from ancient Klingon customs. The armour design and the battles could be harkening back to an older time. Now I don't have a problem with the redesigns or anything like that, because like it's been mentioned, they're from a pre-TOS age, so it's going to be unlike anything we've ever seen, really. I think the whole reason for the complete redesign, apart from licensing issues, is probably because of the fact that by making them look completely different, you've removed them and made them seem much more alien. You're not sure of their motivations anymore, whereas a TOS Klingon or a TNG Klingon, you knew what you were in for when you saw them. Now these ones are completely different. Their culture may have similarities and harken back to the whole principles of honour and everything like that, but they're redesigned, they're new, they're revamped, they've been rebooted, so we don't know what to expect. This places us in the same sort of situation as the crew of the Starfleet ships. They don't know what to expect. They've not encountered Klingons for 100 years, and we're sort of on the back foot here too. So they then initiate something called the Beacon of Kahless, which is a giant flare, effectively, that goes out across all of Klingon space and draws in the leader of every house. They're sort of obligated by honour to actually respond when this goes off, because it signifies a great threat to the entire Klingon race. At this point, the crew of the Shenzhou know that they're there. Burnham's woken up from her 3-hour coma and proceeded to inform them that there are Klingons about and that they should be ready. Now she's a big proponent of course, firing first and asking questions later, especially when it comes to the Klingon. And while Georgiou's been talking to the Admiral to see what she can do on a diplomatic approach, Burnham's been talking to Sarek and asking how the Vulcans have maintained a sort of neutral peace with the Klingons. Now it turns out, Sarek says, this is because every time a Vulcan ship has encountered the Klingons after the first time they were attacked, they've opened fire on them. Now because of the Klingons' culture and psychology, shows of force like this leads to them eventually respecting you, even as an enemy. If a Klingon flares himself up in front of you and puffs out his chest and says, "Come at me, bro," your best bet is to actually come at him. You may get the living shite kicked out of you, but at least you'll have earned their respect, if they didn't kill you by accident. Now this is of course where we see more tension build, because of while Burnham's suggesting this, it sounds like she's being fueled by revenge. After all, she's been attacked by Klingons twice in her past, so it seems like she's letting her emotions override her judgment, even though she's using logic. But then again, this harkens back to that character arc. Is she using logic to inform her opinion, or merely back up her emotional arguments? So Georgiou naturally disagrees with her. Now this is the bit that I didn't see coming, at least not until it immediately happened, but she goes ahead and nerve pinches her to knock her out. Now while this doesn't have any instantaneous ramifications here, I think this is going to be something that's going to be built upon later, because it doesn't exactly go unnoticed. Although Captain Georgiou wakes up barely 5 minutes later, apparently Burnham can't do a solid nerve pinch, events have already been set in motion that are going to force Starfleet's hand anyway. As mentioned, the beacon goes off and the Klingons call for reinforcements, as does Starfleet. So Burnham gets chucked in the brig. Again, this doesn't really have any long-term ramifications because she breaks out again during the fighting. But battle lines have been drawn with the Klingons and Starfleet facing across each other with far too many ships to suggest that there's any sort of peaceful outcome left. Okay, so I forgot to mention, there's also a flashback where we see Burnham beaming aboard the Shenzhou for the first time 7 years ago with Sarek. Now she's introduced to Georgiou, and the two sort of get along eventually. At this stage, Michael Burnham is incredibly Vulcan in her actions and her mannerisms, her clothing, her haircut. She's been on Vulcan for almost her entire life, and I suspect this is probably one of the first few times that she's left. So she's a bit of an outcast, even as a child, even still now as an adult. This sort of mirrors T'Kuvma's backstory as well, because he seems to have been a social outcast as well, from the fact that he's from a dishonoured house. His house has no status, really, and in fact, even as a child, he was beaten up by the other Klingon children for trying to defend his father's crashed vessel, which has been left just to rot and fall to ruin. Now, it's because of this that he sees no problem promoting people who have no house to positions of power within his own religious sect. Now, as it's mentioned, he's not running a house, he's not the leader of a house, he's running this sort of group of highly devoted Klingons who are seeking to return the Klingon order to its old ways of honour and glory. Inevitably, though, conflict breaks out and this Federation and the Klingons start firing at one another. Now, this makes for some spectacular space conflict, which looks pretty good, and it does a fairly good job of conveying the harshness of the war, because the Shenzhou is a really old vessel, hence the old transporter rooms, the older technology, and the look of everything. Which I've got to say, for an old ship, still looks rather modern and sleek. I think one of my favourite bits is when one of the crewmen gets injured and gets sent to sickbay, but it's quite clear that he's got some sort of concussion and is in probably a worse state than he initially appears, because he, rather than go to sickbay, he staggers into Burnham's brig and is just completely confused. He has no idea what she's doing in the brig. He has no idea why he's there. He's like, I was meant to go to the medbay. Why are you here? What's going on? Now, the Shenzhou takes a complete battering in this fight, and of course the brig gets hit. The poor ensign gets vented into space, and Burnham gets isolated in a tiny little containment field with the power failing. Now, this bit's a bit weird because she manages to trick the computer into letting her out based on ethical subroutines. She effectively engages it in a logic puzzle, which, being raised on Vulcan, she's particularly good at, and eventually it opens a hole in the force field, venting her into space, throwing her at the opposing bulkhead through the vacuum of space, to which she survives just about, and makes it a safety, because ethically it can't just let the prisoners die. I think the biggest point of this scene is to emphasise the fact that she is capable of using logic like a tool when she needs to, but it also serves to point out that the AIs that are in the ship's computers are in fact, well, AIs. They're not just some sort of Siri programming on your phone just responding to commands. They do actually have basic thought patterns and processes laid out for them to follow. I think the highlight for the battle for me is when there's a lull in the fighting and the Federation basically opens up diplomatic channels once again. T'Kuvma finally responds to them and says, yes, okay, we'll talk. We can do your human thing. We can chat about it rather than fight it out. Prepare to receive my envoy. And this is when the Klingons go full on badass Viking. They basically ram the Admiral's ship with a giant, I don't know what else to call it, it's just like a giant cleaver ship that just, from being cloaked, rams right through the Europa, and culminating in a spectacular explosion as the Europa self-destructs to try and take it out. Now, bearing in mind it can cloak, so I don't know if it's actually gone or not, but I think it's probably highly likely. So, with the Federation well and truly beaten, the Klingons stop pressing the attack. They've sustained losses, but they've all but obliterated the Federation, stating that any remaining ships are either hiding or they're too badly damaged to do anything, the Shenzhou being one of the latter. This is where the senior staff come up with the idea of capturing T'Kuvma. After all, simply killing him, even if they were capable of firing back, would effectively make him a martyr who's already compared himself to Kaelis, who's already spoken to the other houses and declared his intent to mark the Federation as an enemy. If he were to die now, they're solidifying his place and his point. So they come up with an idea to capture him. And this leads to what I think is probably the best scene of the first 2 episodes. I'll explain why in a minute, but effectively, they decide to put a bomb on one of the Klingon dead. Now this is because they notice that the sarcophagus ship is recovering the dead bodies. As is Klingon custom, they need to be buried and added to the hull of the vessel. By putting a bomb on it, they'll bring it in, they'll detonate it, and theoretically sever the bridge from the rest of the ship because of the Klingon ship design. They can then board the vessel and secure T'Kuvma. Now I think why I like this scene is because while this goes on, T'Kuvma is there merely burying their dead, they're counting their injured. The battle for them is won. And it's sort of a weird thing to see the Federation resort to this sort of underhanded tactic. In fact, by planting a bomb on one of the bodies and having it recovered, almost downright, to use a Klingon word, dishonourable. And it goes a good long way to serve as almost justification for T'Kuvma's point. He is in no doubt still the bad guy in this situation after instigating the whole damn thing, but you can sort of see his approach. As they're doing it with the soundtrack of T'Kuvma mourning and respecting his losses playing over the top, I couldn't help but sit back and think, really? Starfleet, you're gonna do this? Okay, I can see why. You're desperate, you want to... okay. Not sure how I feel about it, but that is a good thing. It starts blurring the lines and the moral standpoint between the two sides. Now, honestly, this isn't very Trek, but we've seen stuff like this before in the Dominion War. Long story short, it doesn't work. Both Georgiou and T'Kuvma end up being killed, seemingly as far as we know. Now, this surprised me a little bit because I expected, although potentially Georgiou to go down with the Shenzhou, which looks like this may be the case as we see escape pods leaving the vessel at the end, I expected T'Kuvma to actually survive and be the antagonist throughout at least most of the series, but this doesn't look like it's going to be the case. And I'm left sort of feeling a bit mixed about that. After all, they spent a lot of time on his backstory and development, and that kind of feels a bit wasted now. His second in command seems to be the one that's taking over in his place, the one that was named Torchbearer, but we don't know much about him. Suffice to say, he was a strong believer in T'Kuvma's cause. That's about it. So, those repercussions I was talking about earlier when Burnham nerve-pinched her captain and effectively tried to seemingly instigate a war by trying to prevent one, by trying to instigate one, it's a bit confusing. Those repercussions are here. She stands in front of an Admiralty board and is effectively court-martialed after pleading guilty to all accounts. Thus endeth episode 2 of Star Trek Discovery. Drama-filled, very action-packed. This is not the Star Trek that we know. It is, as said before, almost a complete revamp. They've called it the Prime Timeline, so it's apparently set in the same universe as Kirk and TOS and The Next Generation, Voyager and DS9, even Enterprise, but I don't see it. It was good, don't get me wrong, I liked it, I was entertained all the time while I was watching it, but it is missing a certain Star Trek feel to it. I think perhaps because not just of the aesthetics, but it's lacking that Star Trek optimism. This future doesn't look like quite a happy place. Even Starfleet, when she ends up facing against the Admiralty board, they're all cloaked in shadow and hidden, and they are very oppressive. It seems like Starfleet's made out to be just as bad as the Klingon Empire. Even the peaceful, logical Vulcans to solutions with the Klingon was to basically open fire on them first. Very aggressive. In short, it's Trek Gym, but not as we know it. And I think ultimately this is going to prove to be a bit of a tragedy, because it's a really good series. It looks amazing, the development into it, despite all the stuff that it's gone through, looks like it came out the other end looking at least halfway decent. Slick, smooth, futuristic, and the characters look like they have promise. The storyline looks like it has promise and somewhere to go. But ultimately, because it looks so different, because it seems out of place with things like Enterprise and TNG, it's going to get picked out. Like a fly in soup, when it's all done, people are going to pick it out and just put it on the side of the plate and say, there you go, Discovery, you can be your own thing over there. Star Trek is this big mix of lots of things, and the revamps, the Kelvin timeline, sits in its own pocket, and now so does Star Trek Discovery. They can call it the Prime Timeline all they like, but I feel like that's what's going to happen. Fans are just going to pick it out, put it on its own plate and say, that's its own thing. That's nothing to do with my version of Star Trek. I mean, they could continue to develop it and build off of it, and to be honest, I would probably still go see that as well. But again, it still feels like it's its own thing. So thanks for listening to my long, rambling spoiler/analysis/review talk on Star Trek Discoveries, episode 1 and 2. Like I say, I'll probably do this for all the episodes, but they're going to be nowhere near this long, considering this was 2 episodes and my initial impressions of Discovery as a series as a whole. I've been Rick, this has been Certifiably In-Game, and thanks for watching. If you like this, feel free to stay tuned for some more. If not, let me know in the comments below anyway. Thanks again. Goodbye.